from my perspective, what we've been doing in literary studies is a kind of complexity studies, or using the sort of concepts of complexity this whole time. And in part, that's because English as a discipline is so much younger than other disciplines. Certainly younger than physics, which we might consider to be one of the oldest disciplines. And it's younger in the sense that it sort of emerges during the Industrial Revolution, during the shift from feudalism to capitalism. It comes in to sort of replace other kinds of hermeneutics, particularly to replace a kind of ways of knowing about biblical texts. And suddenly the literary text is, it's the literature of the working people. It's much more common. And what we start then to see, for instance, with the emergence of the novel, is a linguistic utterance, right? In linguistics, we talk about the difference between language, which is the larger system, right? The sort of abstract system, and then parole is the sort of individual utterances, right? The individual linguistic, whether that's a joke or a yell or a poem or a sermon, those are all what we'd call parole, right? So the linguistic utterance of the novel turns out to be much more complex than something like the epic poem. Because the epic poem is something that's supposed to be sort of stable. It's supposed to represent a singular national view, whereas the novel represents what Mikhail Bakhtin calls the dialogic, or the heteroglossia, right? It's lots of different views sort of smashed together into a single utterance, into a single phrase, into a single sentence. So that when the reader, the agent who is responsible for setting meaning going when they pick up a text and start reading it, can see in a single linguistic utterance meaning shooting off in lots of different directions. In other words, it's inherently complex. And so being able to describe that, to explain how that works and how it affects individuals' understanding of themselves or of their culture, how culture then sort of comes together around particular ways of seeing the world, which might be represented by a novel. Those things all, they're sort of constantly in motion, right? It's your compost in a way. It's always sort of producing a kind of meaning. And the other sort of really cool thing about that is that, and I've certainly experienced this in my own life, every time I come to a novel, the novel hasn't changed. I can read The Great Gatsby. I read it, probably for the first time 25 years ago. I've reread it another, a couple dozen times, and the text doesn't change, except it does, because every time I come to it, I'm a different reader, and I bring different knowledge to it. I bring different experiences. When I'm talking about it with my students, they're saying, "Oh, but." Given my experience, in my reading of this text from the perspective of a 21st century 20-year-old, this is really, has different kinds of meaning, right? So, you sort of see Nick as queerer now than you might have seen him in 1930. And you see Daisy as a bit more of a whiner now than you might have in 1930. You read Moby Dick now, and you can't help but bring feminism to it, because you're reading in a post-feminist universe. The book was written in a pre-feminist world. So there's a life there. There's a sort of openness to literature, and I think language generally, and I think to culture, that I think people in literary studies have always acknowledged. And in fact, that's probably the one thing that they attempt to grapple with the most.